Today, we're diving into the world of European research.
Sounds interesting.
It is. Specifically, we're going to be focusing on how women are represented. Doing these deep dives, I've learned that it's really amazing to see how much variation there is across the continent.
Yeah.
And we've got some incredible data from UNESCO. I mean, really some fascinating stuff. We're going to be trying to answer this big question, like, what can we learn? What can we learn from Europe's different approaches? Because they have a lot of different approaches to supporting women in research.
Yeah, for sure.
I have a feeling we're going to uncover some surprising findings, about which countries are really leading the way when it comes to gender equality in research.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's not always who we expect. I mean, globally, UNESCO reports that, about a third of researchers are women. But that number really just gives us this, broad overview. And when we zoom into specific regions, and especially here in Europe, we see a much more complex and interesting picture emerging.
Wow. It's kind of like looking at, a tapestry with all these different threads.
Yeah.
You ready to dive in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Data on the screen, numbers come alive. Male, female flows where the patterns thrive. Visual charts, public colors unify. Gender decoded, bringing truth to light. Small drum fill. We break it down, real talk. Trends unveiling facts from every block. Here's your insight, watch the data glide. Gender decoded, let the beats collide.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going to be diving into a topic that might sound a little bit dry at first glance, female researchers in Europe, but I think once we really get into the numbers, you're going to find it's anything but boring.
Yeah, it's fascinating, actually. The variation across the continent is pretty incredible. We're talking countries where over half of the researchers are women, and then others that are still struggling to get to 30%.
Wow. Okay, so right off the bat, that begs the question, why such a huge gap?
Yeah, that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. And thankfully, we've got some really, really great data from the UNESCO Institute for Statistics.
UNESCO data. All right, so you've got my attention. I love a good data deep dive. So, before we kind of zoom in on Europe, can you set the scene for us a little bit? Like, where does Europe fit into this global picture of women in research?
Yeah, so globally, there's definitely this momentum building for gender equality in research and development. We've got initiatives like Horizon Europe that are aiming to close this gap. But the reality is, even with all of those efforts, we're still only looking at about a third of researchers worldwide being women.
Okay, so Europe is not an isolated case. Right? But even within Europe, those percentages you mentioned are pretty wild. Let's start with the high achievers. Who's leading the pack and what's their secret sauce?
Well, some of the frontrunners might actually surprise you. We're talking about places like North Macedonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Serbia. They're exceeding 50%.
Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah, and if you look back historically, you start to see this common thread emerge. A lot of these countries had a strong emphasis on STEM education for women, often stemming from their Soviet past.
Hold on. So you're saying that even though the Soviet system had its problems, there's like a legacy of women in science that's still playing out today in these countries?
Precisely. It really highlights how deeply policies, even ones from, decades ago, can impact research today. And it kind of raises some interesting questions for us, too, like what can we learn from that approach, even in totally different contexts?
That's such a good point. So sometimes we have to look back to understand where we are now.
Right.
Okay, so we've got this Soviet legacy going on in some countries, but then there's Iceland, which is basically like synonymous with gender equality these days.
Right. Iceland is always pushing boundaries, it seems. With nearly 50% female researchers, it's a clear example that strong social policies can make a tangible difference.
Right. It's not just talk, it's action.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got our overachievers, some of them with pretty surprising backstories, and then there's the other side of the coin, right? I have a feeling this is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, this is where we hit what some are calling the Nordic paradox.
Okay, the Nordic paradox.
Yeah.
All right, I'm intrigued already. What's the deal with this?
Well, you think about countries like Sweden, Denmark, Finland,
Yeah.
Known for their progressive values. You'd think they'd be at the forefront of this whole thing.
Yeah, you'd assume so, right?
But the reality is they fall short of that 35% mark. when it comes to female researchers. It really challenges the assumption that general societal equality just automatically trickles down into STEM fields.
So even in societies that are like really striving for equality, there can be these hidden pockets where things aren't quite adding up. It makes you wonder if it's not happening in the Nordics, where is it happening?
Right. Well, we are seeing some solid progress in countries like Spain, Portugal, Ukraine, Romania hovering around that 40% mark. They seem to be demonstrating that change is definitely possible. It might not be a quick fix, but they're making progress, suggesting that more targeted strategies can make a difference.
Okay, so we've got the spectrum, former Soviet countries with their unique legacy, the Nordic paradox kind of defying expectations, and this middle ground where real progress is happening. But before we jump into the why behind all of this, I think we need to address those countries at the bottom of the list. Who are we talking about and what's going on there?
Yeah, so we're talking about some major players here. Western and Central European countries, Germany, France, Czechia, the Netherlands, all below 35%.
Really, and these are countries with, thriving economies, advanced research. You'd think they'd be attracting top talent left and right.
You would think.
Yeah, so this is almost like a red flag.
Right.
It suggests there are some deeper systemic issues at play here.
Exactly. It suggests we need to dig a bit deeper. Are there challenges in those countries when it comes to balancing a research career with family? Are there some deeply ingrained perceptions about STEM fields being more masculine? These are all questions we're going to unpack as we move forward.
Okay, I am hooked already. We've got this fascinating map of Europe overachievers, surprising laggards, everything in between. But before we go any further, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Is it even fair to just focus on these percentages? I mean, is there more to this story than just raw numbers?
You're hitting on a really important point. It's not enough to just have a certain percentage of female researchers. We need to look at what their experiences are once they're in those positions.
Okay, so it's not just about getting women through the door. It's about what happens once they're inside. What kind of environment are they walking into?
Exactly. We need to be asking, are they leading research teams? Are they getting the big grants? Are they shaping the research agenda? Are they facing bias? Are they hitting those glass ceilings? These are the nuances we need to consider to get a full picture of gender equality in research.
All right, so we've established that this is about way more than ticking boxes and hitting quotas. This is about understanding the lived experiences of female researchers and getting to the why behind those numbers.
And that's where we'll pick up in part 2. We'll be diving into those why questions, exploring all the factors that are contributing to this really complex landscape. So stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. Last time we were kind of mapping out this landscape of female researchers across Europe. And yeah, honestly, some of those numbers were pretty surprising. But as we were saying, percentages only tell part of the story, right? So now it's time to get into the why, like what's actually driving these patterns? Is it history? Is it culture? Is it economics? What's going on?
Well, it's rarely just one thing, isn't it? It's more like this whole tangled web of influences. But I think to start untangling it, we have to go back to that historical context. Remember those frontrunners we talked about, those former Soviet states?
Yeah, those high percentages were a bit of a curveball. Not exactly what you picture when you think, Soviet era. So help me connect the dots here.
Well, the Soviet system had its issues for sure, but one thing they did prioritize was STEM education, and that included women. They needed a skilled workforce, so they pushed to get women into science and engineering, and even decades later, we're still seeing that legacy play out in those high percentages.
So it's like this unintended consequence, almost like a system designed for one purpose, ends up having this ripple effect on gender representation years down the line.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, what are we setting in motion today that we might not realize the full impact of for years to come?
Right. It's a good reminder that our decisions today have far-reaching consequences. But moving beyond those specific historical circumstances, we also have to factor in the influence of culture.
Okay, culture. That's a big one and kind of hard to pin down. What do you mean specifically?
Well, think about it. If a society just implicitly sends the message that STEM fields are more masculine, or if girls are subtly discouraged from science at a young age, that's going to have an impact on who ends up in research roles. It's not always outright discrimination. It can be these subtle, almost invisible barriers.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's like those unconscious biases we hear so much about, the kind of thing you might not even realize you're doing. but it still shapes people's choices and their opportunities. And I bet those biases don't just stop at career choices either, right?
Exactly. They can impact every aspect of a researcher's life, even family expectations in many cultures. Women are still expected to do the bulk of the childcare and housework, which makes it that much harder to compete in a demanding field like research.
Right. It's like an extra layer of challenges on top of everything else.
Yeah.
So we've got history laying the groundwork, culture kind of subtly shaping perceptions. And then, of course, you've got government policies coming in. It seems like the most obvious way to make change, right?
Policies can definitely be powerful tools. Think about financial incentives to encourage women into STEM fields or quotas for female representation on grant review panels or legislation to promote gender equality in hiring and promotions at research institutions. These are all ways to send a clear signal that things are changing, that women are valued in these fields.
Yeah, it's like putting your money where your mouth is, not just talking about equality, but actually taking steps to make it happen. And we've seen those steps can work. I mean, look at Iceland.
Exactly. Iceland really shows what's possible with intentional policy choices. But sometimes change can come from unexpected places, too.
Oh, are you talking about the economics of research itself? We touched on that a little bit earlier.
Exactly. Think about it. New booming research sectors need talent, and they need it fast. They might be less beholden to those traditional gender norms, more open to shaking things up. It's almost like a fresh start, a chance to build a more diverse and inclusive culture from the ground up.
So maybe these newer fields are like the Wild West of research, less established, more open to change, less stuck in those old ways of thinking. But then what about those more traditional research institutions? Are they just stuck in their ways?
Well-established institutions often have deeply ingrained cultures and power structures. Change can be slower, more incremental. It's not necessarily that people are intentionally resisting. It's just that those old ways of doing things are hard to break. It's like trying to turn a giant ship. It takes time and a lot of coordinated effort.
Okay, so we've got this complex mix of history, culture, government policies, and even the economics of different research fields all kind of shaping the landscape. But there's one piece of the puzzle we haven't really tackled yet, and it's a big one: work-life balance.
Yeah, you're right. That's a critical factor, especially in a demanding field like research. If a country or an institution wants to attract and retain female talent, they have to make it possible for women to have a life outside of the lab.
I mean, nobody should have to choose between a fulfilling career and a fulfilling personal life.
Right.
That's a recipe for burnout and frustration. So what can we do about this? What are some concrete things that can help?
Strong parental leave policies are a great starting point. Making sure both men and women have adequate time to care for their families sends a strong message that work-life balance is valued. Affordable childcare is also crucial. If you're constantly stressed about childcare costs or availability, that's going to take a toll on your career.
So it's about creating a system where people feel supported, not penalized for having families. And that benefits everyone, not just women.
Exactly. When men feel empowered to take parental leave and share in those caregiving responsibilities, it helps break down those traditional gender roles and creates a more equitable environment for everyone.
It's not about fixing things for women. It's about creating a better, more humane research culture for everybody.
Yeah.
A rising tide lifts all boats, right?
Exactly. And ultimately, that's what we want: a research world that's not only world-leading, but also a place where everyone feels welcome, supported, and valued.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground today, from those eye-opening statistics to this complex interplay of history, culture, and economics. But as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of female researchers in Europe, we want to leave you with one final thought. If you had the power to change one thing, to make one bold move, to really accelerate progress towards gender equality in research, what would it be? It's a question worth pondering, not just for those in the scientific community, but for all of us. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.